Elliot had been driving across the moors because he liked the way old stone made his everyday problems seem smaller, a perspective that felt like a mercy after months of deadlines and small emergencies. The castle was an easy detour on a grey morning, a squat silhouette against the low clouds that promised damp air and warm hearths. Inside, the guide's voice was a soft instrument, carrying stories of lineage and loss while the group shuffled on flagstones that remembered centuries of souls. Elliot drifted away from the cluster to the portrait gallery, drawn by habit and the quietness that gathers around things that have been looked at for a long time. The woman in the center caught him first by the precision of her gaze. The blue of her eyes had an almost sculptural depth, painted so carefully that the skin around them seemed to breathe with the light. Her dress was a severe black that had been softened by varnish, her hands folded the way someone trained to hold still does. The gallery had the particular smell of beeswax and old paper, and the day was cool enough that the air felt like fabric pulled taut across his lungs. He lifted his phone to take a quick picture, the kind of small theft tourists perform to claim a moment, and the shutter clicked in the hush, as if obeying the rules of the room. He did not open the photo until evening, when he had returned to his lodgings and the sky outside was a sheet of wet black. He swiped through the image's arches, carved mantles, a bad selfie with the guide, and when the portrait filled the screen, he paused. The frame, the hands, the severe dress were all as he remembered, but the eyes were closed in the image. Lids of painted skin folded over the startling blue as if someone had decided to mask the stare. He laughed at himself at first, a brittle sound in an otherwise quiet room, and blamed camera blur or tiredness. He put the phone aside and tried to sleep, but the photograph had the peculiar weight of something that resists being dismissed. At dawn, he returned to the gallery with an awkward, earnest intention to take more pictures and show himself that the world returned to ordinary with a new glance. The morning light slanted through narrow windows and turned dust into slow flames. The stone felt cool beneath his palms where he braced himself against the sill. The portrait hung exactly as before, and the painted eyes were open and steady, as particular as if they were counting breath. He took 3 photographs quickly, each click a small, deliberate act, and left the gallery with the odd chore of knowing that he had all he needed to prove the world sensible. That night, when he loaded the files onto his laptop, the first 2 photos showed the eyes open, as they had been in the gallery, but the third photo taken in the same sequence showed the lids closed again. Zooming in revealed a faint dark crescent near the corner of the painted eyelid, a suggestion of a smudge or the trace of a fingertip pressed against the varnish and left there to congeal into time. He told himself the mark was meaningless, an artifact of paint and pixel, but the image sat in his mind like a small, cold stone he could not easily pocket. Curiosity shifted into necessity. He returned to the curator, a woman whose manner suggested she had learned to file away visitor questions as a librarian files away letters that may matter later. When he showed her the photos, she regarded them with the quiet concentration of someone confirming an old rumor with new evidence. She told him the portrait was of Lady Margaret, painted after a long illness in the 17th century and moved to that wall when the house was renovated. The curator's voice smoothed into a cadence that held both history and superstition. She admitted restorers sometimes noted disturbances in the paint and that a previous conservator had written of eyelid smudges they could not account for when responding to environmental changes. He tried to accept this as a detail of antique care and moved on with his days. But the sensation of being watched persisted in the small hours when the world is only half sober. He began to notice how portraits in old houses seemed to take in the room in layers, how a painted face could be at once an object and something that felt like an audience. On a damp afternoon he found, improbably, one of the conservator's reports in a small file the curator allowed him to copy. Among the dry ink of varnish mixtures and solvents was a marginal note, sharp and impatient, subject blinks and photographs. No physical cause identified. The more he tried to explain the phenomenon with science camera sensors, lighting artifacts, the oddities of aged varnish, the less satisfying the answers felt. He began keeping the images on multiple devices, copying them into archives with the compulsive care of someone who wants to catch an unruly fact and pin it down. Several nights later, a new file appeared in a folder he rarely opened, a close crop of the portrait with lids half shut, the painted eyelashes whispering shadows across the cheek. He did not remember taking it and could not explain its origin. It was there as if the painting had offered a private view for no other reason than to be seen. People suggested explanations. A prank by a technician, a hoax staged by friends, his own exhaustion manifesting as a trick of perception. None felt adequate because the photograph had a solidity to it that resisted myth-making. Months later, the curator emailed him a careful, formal note letting him know the portrait had been examined during a restoration program. They had found, she wrote, a pocket of air behind the canvas where a small scrap of paper had been tucked generations earlier. The note had only a single line on it, written in a cramped, old hand. Do not stare too long. Some eyes close to keep watch. The curator closed her letter with a polite invitation to visit again, but there was a new tightness to her words, an unspoken weariness. Elliot moved on in the sense that people move on from unsettling things. Life accumulates errands and friends and bills, but a small reflex remained. When he passed antique frames in other houses, he felt the instinctive urge to photograph the faces and then to shut his own eyes, as if to avoid giving them permission to change. Sometimes, late at night, he found himself opening the old files and watching the frames scroll until the lids on the painted eyes seemed to slide with deliberation, deciding whether to sleep or to watch. He could not prove that the portrait had done anything other than change in pixels. He could not prove that the painting had agency. What he could not deny was the residue of the experience, a precise hunger in the air, a sense that certain things are not content merely to be remembered, and a small, unavoidable dread that something behind the varnish might choose, at any moment, to close its eyes and keep its secrets. Anna and Mark had rented the castle on a whim, drawn by photographs that promised turrets and a private wing where the modern world could be left at the gate. The owner was pleasant on the phone and more pleasant in person, producing iron keys with the slow courtesy of someone who enjoyed being old-fashioned. The wing they were given smelled of beeswax and cold smoke and held a suite of rooms connected like chapters in a book, a sitting room with heavy curtains, a four-poster bed with a mattress that remembered every shape it had held, and a small kitchen with a kettle that took its time to boil. That first night they lit candles and opened a bottle of wine and let the low, polite laughter of two people on holiday lay over the stone like a blanket. The sound found them after midnight, thin and close, more like a suggestion than a noisy muffled cry that rose through the floorboards with the quality of a voice speaking from another room. Anna heard it first when she went for more wine, the suddenness of it making her stop halfway to the mantel as if she had been struck by a memory. It was high and frayed at the edges, and for a moment she thought it might have been an animal until the syllables resolved into something that sounded like a plea. She stood very still, every small muscle alight, and when she called Mark in the doorway, his face shifted from amusement to something sharper. They told themselves explanations because people are gifted at drafting sense from uncertainty. It could have been a fox trapped in the eaves, a pipe groaning with the night's chill, the neighbor's television bleeding through ancient walls. The next morning Anna found the caretaker in the kitchen, a woman with a practical manner and a face that had learned to smooth alarm into routine. Anna described the sound, careful to frame it as a curiosity rather than a panic, and the caretaker listened and then delivered an answer so precise it felt rehearsed. There was no cellar beneath that wing, she said. The foundations there rested on solid bedrock and the house plans bore her out. She suggested settling noises, old heating flues, even the natural expansion and contraction of timber. Her certainty settled over them like a lid. Still, the sound returned at night with a confidence that flattened their rational guesses. This time it was closer and threaded with attempted speech or repetition, like someone practicing a single word. The candles threw long, nervous shadows, and the air cooled as if the house itself were inhaling the sound and letting it fall again. Mark and Anna tried to ignore it, to make light of their fear, telling each other stories and turning the television up until the muffled voice faded like a reluctant tide. Yet when the house settled, they both lay awake. The silence after the sound feeling less like peace than the hush after an argument. On the second day, they examined the floors with the kind of method that becomes urgent when ignorance becomes dangerous. They tapped boards, listened for hollowness, and slid rugs to inspect seams. The wood was old and honest with its creaks, nothing like the neat hollow a cellar would leave. But in the corner of the sitting room, a strip of floor felt colder underfoot, and when Anna pressed her ear to it, the sound came through clearer, the same strained syllables, as if someone were trying to press a word through a thick cloth. They lifted a loose board and found not a ladder or a descent, but a shallow channel carved into the stone beneath, a narrow groove that ran lengthwise under the floor like the memory of a stream. It was far too small for a person to have been placed there, yet the sides bore scratches and there was a thin line of darker stains that had sunk into the grain, as if the stone had absorbed. something it wanted to remember. They called the caretaker back, and she knelt with a lantern, her expression blank in the way people's faces go blank when they realize their certainties are being asked to cover more than they can. She admitted that old houses sometimes kept odd things in their bones voids where builders had expected support. Channels for water long diverted. Spaces that had been repurposed so many times their original functions were untraceable, but she insisted again that there was no cellar beneath that wing. When the light from her lantern touched the scratches, the muffled sound swelled as if the stone had been waiting for acknowledgement, and a fragment of a word pushed itself up with a pressure that made Anna's teeth ache. Please. The local council was called the next day. Men in reflective vests walked the wing with measuring tapes and polite skepticism, declaring the foundation sound and the floor plans consistent with the caretaker's knowledge, but their instruments reported anomalies. A series of shallow cavities under certain boards and a narrow trench that appeared to have been carved long before the current plans were drawn. A surveyor suggested that the channel might have been part of an ancient drainage system, later mistaken for storage or passage. The explanation seemed plausible in the clear light of day. But that night the muffled voice altered in cadence, as if pleased or offended by the attention. It pulsed beneath their feet in a rhythm that could be mistaken for engineering. But when Anna pressed her ear again, she could make out the tremulousness of a human breath. They left before dawn, their decision driven less by the official reports than by a domestic knowledge of how small fears swell in private. On the road, the headlights washed the world into ordinary rectangles, and the castle became a dark silhouette receding in the rearview mirror. But the sound did not shrink with distance. Sometimes, when traffic slowed and they were momentarily quiet, Anna thought she could feel the vibration through the car's floorboards like a stored complaint. She told herself that people are prone to meaning-making, that old stone stores echoes, and that voices can be the imagination's most reliable ghost. Weeks later, a postcard arrived in a looping hand from the caretaker. The council had returned, she wrote, and had sealed parts of the wing while consulting specialists. Their tools discovered nothing that explained the apparent human sound, only traces of old repairs and a shallow channel consistent with a utilitarian drain. At the bottom of the postcard, in smaller script, she had written one more sentence that made Anna's skin go tight. Stone keeps secrets. In our house, it sometimes answers back. They never went back to the castle. At night, there are moments when the floor of their apartment seems to take on the scale of the old wing, and Anna will kneel and press her ear to the boards as if the act could redeem something, offer a courtesy to the plea that may or may not have been born of human need. The sound never returns in their home, only a small residual sensation that beneath ordinary surfaces something may still be listening. She does not know whose voice they heard, or whether the channel beneath the castle floor once conveyed something living or something else. And the lack of answer has a gravity of its own. The mystery sits in them like an unfinished sentence, persistent and patient, waiting perhaps for someone to lift the wrong board and hear whatever has been trying to get out.
Ethan had been doing aerial work for 5 years, shooting real estate and landscape reels that paid the bills and gave him an excuse to be outside on good days. When a travel site asked for footage of the old keep on the ridge, he accepted because ruins were good for light and for the kind of solitude his editor liked. Hollamore Keep sat above the marsh like an argument the countryside could not settle. Walls softened by lichen, an inner courtyard filled with bramble, and one tower that, in every modern photograph and council notice, had caved in decades earlier into a mound of rubble. The farmer at the lane shrugged when Ethan asked permission to fly, waved a hand toward the ridge, and said the usual cautions about falling stone. The air that morning tasted of iron and distant rain, and made him glad he had brought 2 batteries. He launched the quadcopter from a patch of scraped grass, and watched the rotors find a steady buzz beneath a sky that was thin and honest. From above, Hollamore spread like a small city for birds, concentric walls, collapsed galleries, and the jagged edge where architects had recorded the tower's death 30 years before. He circled, framing the ruin with the efficient calm of someone who knows how to turn motion into images, and noticed an intact pane of glass near the top of the highest surviving wall. For a moment he thought it was a trick of leftover glazing or a reflection, but as the drone eased closer, a small face resolved in the rectangle, a pale child framed by the stone, hands against the sill, as if to steady a body that had learned to wait. He hovered and zoomed until the pixels answered every question he had about scale. The child did not startle, did not shift like someone hiding from a noise. but looked straight at the lens with an attention that made the hair along Ethan's neck lift. A hand lifted in a slow, deliberate wave, the motion so small and exact that it might have been practiced for an audience of one. The tower, by every measure he knew, did not exist in the form that framed that window. It had been a stump of broken masonry when the council photos in the archive showed reconstruction after the storm. He told himself someone could have climbed and found refuge, a local child playing at peril. Perhaps the practical explanations were his ballast against the small cold that had settled into his chest. Back at the van, he watched the footage with the kind of attention editing demands and the strange impatience of someone waiting to be proven wrong. The child's face filled the screen. The complexion was like washed paper, hair the color of straw, eyes set in a stare that felt older than the afternoon. He scrubbed through the frames and noticed tiny things that made the skin under his collar tighten. A smudge of dark soil on the sill, a thin line of dry moss clinging in the stone's crevice. And in one frame, the child's profile tightened and a small sound lifted that, played back, could have been the beginning of a word. He stopped the clip and let the silence of the van answer him like a question. He uploaded the best shot with a neutral caption and a location fence for safety, expecting the usual mix of awe and skepticism. The comments arrived in the way the web does some kruba. One message lodged at the top of his inbox and would not let go. A scanned black and white from an old search party, sent by a woman who identified herself as Elsie, and signed in a hand that trembled with memory. The photograph was of residents with coats buttoned against rain and hands joined in line across a marsh. And in the middle, framed by muddy boots, a small boy in a dark hood looked directly into the camera with a face so pale it matched the child in Ethan's footage. On the back, someone had written a date and a single surname. He drove back the next day because curiosity has that moral component editors don't like to admit. It requires action. The village was quieter than the map suggested, and people watched him with a caution that had nothing to do with drones, more a careful pity. The way one looks at a bruise and then pretends not to. He spoke to the farmer, to the woman in the post office, to the retired builder who remembered where the tower had fallen, and each told variants of the same story. A storm in the 70s, a child last seen near the keep that day. Searches that found only small things out of plaza, scarf, a button, a footprint that led to reeds and ended. The builder showed him a faded council note about part of the tower being rebuilt over voids and rubble, a practical line that left a strange space where nothing could deny the possibility of concealment. He flew again, hands steadier, though the chill he felt now was not only from the wind. The child was in the same window. This time the figure leaned forward and, with a motion that was almost polite, cupped a small hand around the mouth and mouthed something that, slowed and enlarged on his laptop, seemed to form the letters of a name. The recording carried an odd quality of time. The light in the stone looked like a photograph from another season, and when Ethan isolated the frames he could see, for a blink, the ruined upper masonry reconstructed in a way that matched postcards from before the collapse. It was as if the lens had found a seam in the ruin and peeled back a layer of decades. The clip traveled faster than he expected. Amateur historians pored over it, deride thrill seekers tried to locate the exact coordinates, and a few people with more careful tongues suggested the idea of residual imagery, a theory that historic places sometimes reassert moments of their past when conditions aligned. That explanation satisfied some and infuriated others. Elsie wrote again, sending another photograph from a family album where the small boy's face was clearer, the same blank attentiveness carved into black and white. And in her message she admitted she had never understood why he had seemed so patient, waiting on a day that had turned into a search. Months later, a local mason who had dug shallow test pits near the collapsed ring sent a terse note. They had found voids and pockets, courses laid over older stonework, a few child-sized items compacted between rubble-like offerings. He wrote that the upper courses had been built into pockets during a hurried restoration, and that those pockets could, conceivably, hold small things, not people. He added carefully, because the measurements contradicted such an idea, just objects caught in the masonry's slow hunger. Ethan stared at the measurements and thought of the child at the window and could not reconcile the two. He stopped flying over ruins after Hollamore, because some images take up the moral space that lenses cannot empty. Sometimes at night he opens the file and slows the frame until the child's lips seem to form a syllable he cannot place. He does not know whether the face belonged to a boy who vanished in a storm, to a trick of light shaped by stone, or to something that occupies the margins where memory and photograph overlap. The uncertainty has weight. It settles in his chest like a small stone he cannot set down. He keeps the footage on a drive he rarely opens, and on certain thin evenings he will watch the child at the window until the light in the ruined keep seems to reconstruct itself, and the face looks less like a ghost and more like a patient, waiting person, and he wonders who, exactly, that person was waiting for. Claire had booked the castle on a whim. An impulsive decision after a month of deadlines left her craving the uncomplicated gravity of stone and history. The listing promised a private suite in a wing that had been kept in period, and she liked the idea of sleeping in a place that remembered more than her apartment ever could. The owner met her with the practiced warmth of someone who knows how to receive guests in an old house. A brief tour, a tray of tea, and directions about where to leave shoes. The suite itself had been exactly as advertised: a high-ceilinged room with a four-poster bed, a carved armoire, a writing desk facing a narrow mullioned window, and heavy velvet curtains that kept the morning light respectful. That first evening she lit the candles left for her, read by their amber, and felt the odd slow relief that comes from being somewhere that smells of beeswax and cedar. She woke in the pale hours, not with a start, but with the intimate disorientation of someone who has slept too deeply. The sheets were cool. Her phone read 3 in the morning, and the room seemed a fraction too silent. When she threw back the covers and swung her legs over the bed, the light was different, and her pulse, for no obvious reason, picked up. The armchairs were gone. In their place, arranged in 2 rows facing the hearth, sat narrow wooden benches, their surfaces sanded and plain as pews. The writing desk had been removed, and in its stead stood an iron contraption, a frame of bars and leather straps whose silhouette cut straight across the candlelight like a question. Where the rug had been, flagstones lay exposed, their seams dark with age. There was no furniture where she had left it, and nothing ordinary to explain why. For a moment she thought of sleepwalking, of confusion carried into action by a mind that had not yet fully woken. She checked the doors. They were latched in the manner the owner had shown her the night before. She found her phone on the bedside table and clicked on the flashlight. The beam jerking across carved wood and the brass of sconces. The tray of tea sat undisturbed on the mantel. A glass that had held water the night before now rested beside the hearth, replaced by a wooden bucket. Her breath felt too loud in the small room, and the candle flame flickered with an impatience she had not noticed before. She forced herself into movement, methodical like someone delaying panic. Against the armoire she found a small slip of paper, edges browned as if tucked away for years, a line of script in a hand that had once been practiced for economy rather than flourish. We do not wake what sleeps kind. No salutation, no signature. The words felt like a seal. She folded the paper and held it in her palm until the paper warmed and slackened beneath her fingers. She went downstairs to speak to the owner, telling herself a rational story about cleaners, a theater troupe, or an elaborate marketing stunt designed to thrill guests into social media posts. The owner listened with a gravity that was almost apologetic and yet carried an odd, private reserve he did not offer to explain. "I keep parts of the house as they were," he said carefully when she described the benches and the iron frame. "For guests who like authenticity. Sometimes rooms change slightly between guests. It is old wood. It moves." His smile was small and cultivated, like a hand trained to meet questions with calm. She asked if anyone had entered her suite, and he answered that no one had been in. Staff abided by the rules. She asked if the castle had been used for historical reenactments, and he admitted, after a pause, that once every few years they had a private group that practiced period crafts in closed wings. She probed for a name and got only the shrugged, dismissive, "Not in this wing." That afternoon they pried up a loose panel on the landing and found, beneath the boards, not a secret chamber but the imprint of long usage, scuffs that looked like the drag of ropes, faint notches on stone that suggested repeated fastening, a small circle worn into the floor where a pillar or post might once have stood. It was a map of past purpose laid flat in grain and mortared evidence, perhaps, that the room had hosted exercises of a kind now obsolete. The owner called a conservator to inspect the iron frame and the benches, and the conservator, with the languid patience of someone used to restoring old things, said the wood was genuine 17th century, much of it salvaged from older parts of the house and reused in renovations over time. He explained that old houses are patchworks, and that parts sometimes resurface where no one expects them, but his technical explanations did not settle the hollow that had started in Claire's chest. That night she slept poorly. Each time the house creaked, she imagined the benches scraping into alignments and the iron straps tightening in a soundless rehearsal. In the dim hours, she dreamed of the room arranging itself, of servants ghosting through late chapters of the household record, of a ledger of discipline that had become ritual and then memory. She woke with the sense that the room was waiting, as if it had not merely been set but prepped for an audience. On her last morning, she packed slowly, running her hands over the bench backs as if to memorize the curve of the wood. At the door, the owner handed her a receipt and a small, apologetic smile. "We prefer to leave some rooms as they were," he said again. "They are stubborn to the modern world." She wanted to ask whether the preparations had ever been used for harm in the past, whether anyone had been made to learn a lesson in a room like that. There was something surgical about the arrangement that suggested practice rather than spontaneous cruelty. The words stalled in her mouth because the owner's face closed around some private memory, and he said instead, "Old houses keep their own practices. Some guests prefer not to see them." She left the castle with the paper folded in her pocket and the shape of the iron frame imprinted behind her eyes. Days later she found, among emails and receipts, a photograph a friend had snapped when she still felt inclined to narrate her trip. In the background of the image, captured by chance through an open corridor, the benches were visible, neat and ordered, their backs facing the camera like a congregation. A smear beside one bench looked, on careful inspection, like the faint abrasion of old rope against wood. She deleted the photo and then restored it and deleted it again because there are images that do not want to be lost. She has not returned. Sometimes at night, when the city around her presses close and the light in her apartment pools modest and tidy, she still feels the memory of that room pressing against her. She has learned to avoid romanticizing history as charm. Old places are repositories of practiced behaviors, and sometimes the past organizes itself as if waiting for people to remember how to play the old roles. The slip of paper "We do not wake what sleeps" kind sits in her drawer, folded thin, and she keeps it as a reminder that some rooms are less like museums and more like rehearsals, that history sometimes insists on an audience, and that an empty bench can be more accusatory than any voice.